Once one of the cornerstones of any UK high street, after 200 years though, its place here is looking shaky. And in a bid to buy a bit of time, Debenhams is putting itself into administration. Beleaguered bosses are in damage limitation mode, saying it's simply a move to avoid suppliers pushing them into insolvency while coronavirus closes its doors. But this is the second time in 12 months administrators have been called in. Of course, Debenhams has been struggling for some time, but its problems are now being repeated across the business world as companies are suddenly finding no cash coming in. And that squeeze is likely to continue. Just today, new data revealed that consumer confidence has been hit by the biggest fall since records began. And that's just the latest evidence of a dramatic collapse of economic activity not seen in almost a century. One estimate today suggests the lockdown has cut economic output by an extraordinary 31%. That means it's costing us all £2.4 billion a day. Among the areas hardest hit, hotels and restaurants down £172 million, manufacturing down by £500 million, and non-food shops down by £156 million. But earnings won't simply start whenever this shutdown ends, say analysts.
We certainly can't assume that on day one after the lockdown restrictions are eased, that things are going to bounce right back up to the pre-lockdown level and that we're immediately in a matter of months going to make up for all of this lost output. Certainly some businesses are going to see a pickup in activity as the restrictions are eased. But for other ones, they are really losing output, which they will arguably never get back.
The drip feed of bad news from industry after industry is speeding up. March is traditionally the best month of the year for car sales. Last month, they were down 45% compared to last year. Even before the doors shut, many customers were staying at home, many more afraid of getting themselves into increased debt. March sales fell to the lowest level in more than 2 decades. And with production forecast down 23%, there's no bounce back in sight. The slowdown may be almost universal, but the pain isn't shared out equally, according to new research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Women, younger workers and low earners are particularly vulnerable because they are more likely to work in areas like retail and leisure. The IFS found that women are a third more likely to work in an affected sector than men. Workers under 25 are 2.5 times more likely to be hit than other employees, and low earners 7 times more likely than high earners to work in a shuttered business. The longer this drags on, they warn, the longer the recovery.
Long-run impacts can come because people lose their job now and it takes them a while to get back into work. They may get back into work on lower wages than they otherwise would have had, and they may already have been on relatively low wages. If you spend some time out of the labour market, particularly for young people, that may have quite a long-term effect on their income. So if it's already those who are the less well-paid who are affected, they may be less well-paid for a longer period.
For some firms that were limping by before, coronavirus has forced their hand. Laura Ashley calling in the administrators last month. Many others are still struggling on, but the question is, which names will survive and which names will disappear completely?
Paul McNamara. Well, joining me now is the newly appointed Shadow Chancellor, Anneliese Dodds. Congratulations on the job and thanks for coming on the programme. Let me ask you, first of all, what you would have done differently compared to the Chancellor, who has lavished billions of taxpayers' money on this crisis. What would you have done differently?
Well, obviously, this is an unprecedented crisis. It was going to be challenging for any government to put the relevant provisions into place. I have to say that, I'm pleased in some areas that the government has acted. In some cases, it did take some time to put those measures into place. And I suppose that's the first place that I would start. If we look at the furlough scheme, for example, that scheme which backfills people's salaries up to 80% to a cap. Now, that scheme is absolutely critical for keeping people in work because, as we've just heard, from the moment that somebody leaves work and becomes unemployed, that's can be catastrophic for their income, but it's also very, very bad for the economy as well. Now, it took quite some time for that scheme to be put into place and for government to actually talk to the trade unions and to businesses about that scheme. At least it's in place now, but we really need to make sure that as many employers as possible participate in that scheme. It's absolutely critical that they retain that amount of employment, if at all possible. Now, one of the things that may have put off some employers from using it, of course, is the fact that it doesn't cover all of their fixed costs. Right. It might cover salaries, but it doesn't necessarily cover, their electricity bills, rent, etc. Now, that means that the loan scheme that government put in place is absolutely critical. Initially there were problems with that. We pointed those out. Some changes have been made, but we really need to ensure that the banks are actually getting that money out of the door. Now, of course, it is going to be difficult. Sorry, go on.
Exactly, which is, of course, what the government itself has been saying. But when it comes to some of the big ticket items, virtually nationalising the railways, guaranteeing 80% of salaries, these are the kind of things that Jeremy Corbyn was dreaming of doing, in his most socialist dreams, if you like, and now they're actually happening under a Tory government. So has Rishi Sunak, in a way, made your job redundant?
Well, as I said, with that furlough scheme, with the 80% wage guarantee, while I absolutely welcome it and it's necessary, we were calling for that for quite some time before government began discussions with trade unions and with businesses about putting in place. Now, I accept it was a challenge to get it into place, but we can't have that kind of delay in the future. Again, it took quite some time for the package for self-employed people to be put into place. And I accept that's difficult, but actually we've now got quite large numbers of people who, for the first time, are trying to access social security because none of these schemes cover them. And when they try and do so, as you know, they've got to wait for a very, very long time before they get anything, and all they get after 2 weeks is a loan.
Okay.
We would not be adopting that approach. We think that loan's got to be switched into a grant. Otherwise, we're going to have even more extreme levels of penury. Briefly
and finally, who do you think should pay for the enormous amounts of money that have been borrowed here?
Well, we're told that currently so many people are sacrificing a huge amount because of this crisis, and that's absolutely right. But as was just mentioned in your programme, actually the impact of all of this is falling very, very unequally. We need to make sure in the future that it's those with the broadest shoulders who are actually contributing to our recovery where they can. That's going to be really, really critical as we go forward, particularly when so many people will have so little income.
Anneliese Dodds, sorry to cut you short. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming on the programme.